This is Chapter 1, the study of American government. This should be a review for you, all right, of things that you learned in U.S. history. The objective of this chapter is really twofold. There are two major questions: who governs and to what ends? The book will focus on the first question, and you'll be developing your own answers for the second question. Okay? So first, what is political power? This is the first theme. So you're asking two questions: who governs, to what ends, and as the text focuses on who governs, and in answering this question, looks at how the government makes decisions on a variety of issues, they'll look at a couple of things. First, they'll look at power. All right, what is basically the definition of power? The book then takes you and talks about power as it is used to affect who will hold government office and how government will behave. Then they'll talk about authority, the right to use power. Not all who exercise political power necessarily have the authority to do so. Then there's legitimacy. What makes a law or constitution a source of right? Many people struggle over what makes authority legitimate, and that struggle over what makes authority legitimate constitutes much of U.S. history. It's necessary for government to be in some sense democratic in the United States today in order to be perceived as legitimate. But is democracy today the same as the democracy of the founders? Here's a list of what your textbook author believes is the government's greatest achievements, or a top 10 list. It's interesting to look at this because it may not necessarily be what you think are the 10 greatest achievements. So what is democracy? Well, I asked you to write it on a card today in class, okay? And this is how, all right, your book tries to define it. Democracy describes at least 3 different political systems. Now, what you have is you can have a direct or participatory democracy, or you can have a representative democracy. The next slide deals with the inset in your book on page 6 about entering the United States and what, all right, individuals must do in order to enter the United States. All right, and we'll look at this as a distribution of power being done for the purpose of controlling immigrants and citizenship. Okay, all right. So is representative democracy the best? Well, the text says that the Constitution does not contain the word democracy, but it contains the phrase Republican form of government. A representative government, or a representative democracy, requires leadership competition if the system is to work. In other words, it requires a meaningful choice for voters, and it requires some type of free communication. If you look back historically, okay, at democracy, you find the 3 different political systems, and here they are. First, you have the Aristotelian system, or the rule of the many. That's a direct or participatory democracy. That comes out of the 4th century Greek city-state, and we see it in the New England town meeting. Another one, the representative or the elitist theory of democracy, is the acquisition of power by leaders via competitive elections. And the justification for that is, all right, democracy is impractical for reasons of time, expertise, etc. And people make unwise decisions based on fleeting emotions. And if you go along with a representative democracy, you're more apt to find that certain numbers of people that are more that can be elected, that are more competent than others. At least that's it in theory. Okay. So how is power distributed in a democracy? Well, in majoritarian politics, the leaders themselves are constrained to follow wishes of the people very closely. This applies when issues are pretty simple and clear. In elitism, all right, distribution, you have rule by an identifiable group of persons who possess a disproportionate share of political power. Theories on political elites we've seen in Karl Marx's form, government merely a reflection of underlying economic forces, primarily the pattern of ownership of the means of production, and government is controlled by the dominant social class. By C. Wright Mills, where we have a power elite composed of key corporate leaders, military leaders, and political leaders, the control is by those groups, and those groups are served by the government. The government does not serve the people. And Max Weber's elitism, which is you hire somebody who has expertise and some specialized competence, a bureaucrat will dominate. The founders or the framers favored a representative democracy because the government would then mediate, not mirror, popular views. But people themselves were viewed as lacking knowledge and susceptible to manipulation. So the framers' goal was to minimize the abuse of power by a tyrannical majority or by office holders, and that's where we get the Electoral College. Okay? So here you have it again, the class view. Government is dominated by capitalists. All right, we did not mention that one before. The power elite view and the bureaucratic view and the pluralist view, the belief that competition among all affected interests shapes public policy. It's interesting, keep note of that pluralistic view. The next question is democracy driven by self-interest? Okay, and if you check your textbook, your text will tell you that the framers did not think that the will of the people was synonymous with the common interest of the public good. Okay, and that goes along with mediating and not mirroring popular views. They adhered to the fact that representative democracy also proceeds slowly, prevents sweeping changes, and they said, doing great good quickly can necessarily bring harm at times. But they also agreed that majority opinion should figure in the enactment of many or most government policies. But they still insisted on the protection of civil rights and liberties. So I guess, the bottom line is that representative democracy, as they saw it, was a way of minimizing the chances that power would be abused. And is there a self-interest here? Well, there is a human desire for self-preservation, and that leads people to want a government that will enable them to own property and increase their supply of food and do really well. All right, but is that self-interest? And I think that's something that's debatable. Okay, so you've got 4 views of political power. All right, you have the class view, the power elite view, the bureaucratic view, and the pluralistic view. And so how that power, of the 4 views of how that power has been distributed in the United States, the pluralistic view does the most to reassure one that America has been and continues to be a democracy in more than name only. Okay? But it may lead to some cynical conclusion. And there is plenty of self-interest among political elites, but it does not necessarily follow that the resulting policies will be self-serving. So keep that in mind. Okay. Political change. What explains political change? Okay. They're listed here for you. There are a number of items that discuss political change. And there are some good examples in your book. There's an example on page 12 about foreign affairs, or the case of foreign affairs and how historically how we have taken an active role in foreign policy and foreign affairs at certain periods of our history. And those policies have been shaped by a number of different things. So other than just general beliefs in how democracy should run. So you probably should take a look at that example. Okay. I would just take you to that page and have you look at those examples in your book. What explains political change? This is very true. First of all, deep-seated beliefs in how we are. The great shifts, as your book tells you, in the character of our government, its size, scope, institutional arrangements, direction of its policies, have really reflected sudden changes sometimes in elite or mass beliefs about what the government is supposed to do. And I think by looking at those examples, you can see that. Major economic developments like the 1920s or the Great Depression, or just the preceding recession that we've just had, all right, really causes political change. And competing opinions. Look at the rise of the Tea Party. Okay. And last, I think this is the close to the end of the chapter, is the nature of politics. Are there any clear answers supported by evidence to the questions? Who governs? We can give controversial responses, partial responses, but the real reasons are found in the nature of the subject. This isn't an economics class. Political scientists are interested in how preferences are formed, and they're interested in how comparing ways of satisfying those preferences. Okay. Keep in mind that political scientists don't necessarily look at just economic costs. You can see that with the rise in the debt ceiling, all right, the amount of money that's been spent for defense and for war. I think that's a given. So, and once you take into account civil rights and liberties, that's where it lies. That we see that there is no definitive answer but controversial responses. This we will take up in class. This is the debatable issue. What would you do? And these are the arguments. Make sure that you check the review at the end of the book and the summary at the end of the chapter on page 16 with the questions: who governs and to what ends.